It started at 1:46 p.m. with a tweet.
US President Joe Biden announcing he is quitting the presidential race.
Joe Biden sent the tweet from his beach house in Delaware, where he was isolating with COVID. For months, he had been angrily swatting down questions about whether he was up to the challenge of beating Donald Trump in the November election, with each call for him to stand down met with increasing levels of White House rage. But COVID, a terrible debate, and some catastrophic-looking poll numbers were the final straws. As he sent his withdrawal tweet, the action began at the Naval Observatory, the residence of the Vice President Kamala Harris. Just 1 minute after Joe Biden's tweet, she was on the phone drumming up support. She kept dialing. Congressional leaders, fundraisers, friends, rivals, she called them all. At 2:13 p.m, Joe Biden endorsed her as his successor on the ticket. At 4:48 p.m, the paperwork was filed, converting the Biden campaign into the Harris campaign. And she kept dialing, averaging one call every 6 minutes for 10 hours. She told each person, "I wasn't going to let this day go by without you hearing from me." By the following afternoon, her campaign had reportedly raised $81 million in donations, a record amount in one day. By the time Joe Biden gave his actual resignation address to the nation, Kamala Harris was in the clear, endorsed by not only the president, but all of her potential rivals for the nomination as well. This is extraordinary for many reasons, not least the fact that in the last two presidential election cycles there has been a bitter war over who will be the party's candidate, with sometimes more than 24 people in the running. But not this time, and there's a good reason for that. See, a situation a lot like this has happened before. 56 years ago, after a late announcement from the president that he wasn't running for re-election.
The statement on his own future came as a complete surprise even to his close associates.
The Democratic Party launched into a bitter civil war, a catastrophic error that threw the party into the wilderness for more than 2 decades. Today, the tale Democrats tell each other instead of ghost stories around a campfire. The story of 1968 and why, if they want to beat Donald Trump, they can't let it happen again. I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening.
So don't worry about it. Come on.
Secrets are hard to keep in presidential politics, but President Lyndon Baines Johnson had a big one, and he managed to keep it for years. Only he, his wife, and 4 aides knew the secret. On the 31st of March 1968, he was about to reveal it.
And tell Walter I saw him and thought he was very good today.
At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was in the White House, rehearsing for a TV address.
Cut out this A here.
The teleprompter, which at this point consisted of a scroll of paper, a little winch and a mirror bolted to the front of a camera, had 40 minutes of text on it, but no ending.
Gosh, this is hard to read, Jim. You have no idea.
As he read through the text, asking for changes here and there, he didn't seem too stressed. He was coughing and snorting, though. He had one of his very frequent colds.
Indonesia. Political.
He finished the rehearsal and went off to get ready.
Good night.
At 7:30, his press secretary arrived with 5 pages to be typed onto the end of the prompter scroll. The 5 pages of text had been sitting in the president's pocket for weeks. He'd had them on him during the State of the Union address, but decided at the last minute not to use them. As the final page was typed onto the prompter, a White House aide opened his mouth in shock. His pipe, which had been in his mouth at the time, fell to the floor. Johnson was not running for re-election. He and his wife had decided this 4 years earlier. Johnson was only 59, but he'd had a massive heart attack when he was 46.
At the time, there were fears that he would not recover. It was at this time that he gave up smoking.
While he'd managed to give up his 3-pack-a-day habit, his health had been bad for years, and then he became the president.
Mr. Johnson, in taking over from the assassinated President Kennedy on November 23, 1963, began his reign with the overwhelming support of the American people and the Congress.
The stress of the presidency only made his health worse.
President Johnson has had a series of gallbladder and kidney trouble.
He and his wife, Lady Bird, made a pact. He'd run for re-election in 1964, but not in 1968. it wasn't a hard promise to keep. Despite outnumbering their enemy by 3-1 and with vastly more advanced technology, the US and their allies were losing the Vietnam War. Many Americans were refusing to be drafted, and many more wanted him to bring the troops home.
This chart shows the huge slide in popularity. More and more Americans have become cynical about the nature of his leadership and his personal sincerity as a man.
So after his 40-minute speech on the state of the war in Vietnam, incidentally the first ever live satellite broadcast seen in Australia, he told the world that he was done.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
LBJ had kept his cards close to his chest. Nobody had seen it coming. The election was 6 months away, and the other side already had a presumptive candidate, Richard Nixon.
Let's win it for America and for those who want peace and freedom in the world. Let's go!
Polling indicated it was a tight race, but Johnson was losing support from inside of his own party. This should feel uncomfortably familiar at this stage. It's almost exactly the situation the Democrats are in now, except on a much shorter timeline. On the 23rd of August 1968, a pig was arrested by police in Chicago.
A black and brown pig named Pegasus.
A crowd of anti-war protesters had gathered in downtown Chicago to nominate Pegasus as their candidate for US president. And if you're going to nominate a pig to be the president, Chicago is the place to do it. The Chicago Union Stockyards was both the home of the 1968 Democratic National Convention and the beating heart of the American meat industry. At its peak, it could slaughter 160,000 hogs and 24,000 cattle a day. 80% of America's meat came from the yard. The Democratic Party's convention was set to be held in the Stockyards amphitheatre in amongst the abattoirs. But nominating a pig to be president in a mock party convention, that's not the kind of nonsense that was allowed in Mayor Richard J. Daley's town.
Police seized the pig and arrested about 10 of the yippies on charges of breach of the peace.
Chicago had seen multiple riots and protests in the lead up to the convention, and Mayor Daley, a tough, no-nonsense Irish Catholic Democratic Party power broker, had ordered the police
To shoot to kill any arsonist or anyone with a Molotov cocktail in their hand in Chicago, to fire a building because they're potential murderers,
and
to shoot, to maim, or cripple anyone looting any stores in our city.
Chicago was kind of a mess. Strikes, protests, riots, but Mayor Daley insisted he could still host the Democratic Party's convention successfully.
We will not permit anyone to create disturbances and to create riots in our city.
Usually, the national conventions are merely a formality. The party decides who their presidential candidate will be through the primary voting process.
Primaries are an American peculiarity, the booby-trapped obstacle course over which people who want to become President of the United States must run.
I'm not going to go into how it all works because it's complicated and it's changed a lot since 1968. But basically, both regular rank-and-file members and top party officials get a say in who the nominee is. The convention is basically a coronation ceremony to give the candidate a final boost into the home stretch to Election Day. But by pulling out of the race in March, midway through the primary process, President Johnson had started a free-for-all. For many, their favourite prospective candidate was John F. Kennedy's little brother Bobby.
So far, at least, Bobby Kennedy's bandwagoning seems to have struck the right notes. Will the glib speech and teeny bopper hairstyle be enough to handle the presidential campaign?
But Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, just as his campaign started gathering serious momentum. So, RFK is dead, LBJ isn't running. Who's next?
Senator McCarthy of Minnesota is trying to defeat him. He's given no chance at all.
Senator Eugene McCarthy, prickly, bitter, fiercely anti-war, had won the popular vote in the primaries after Bobby Kennedy's death. But he almost certainly wasn't going to be the nominee. LBJ had decided who he wanted to win, and it wasn't going to be the guy who had been calling him a war criminal. He was backing his own vice president, Hubert Horatio Humphrey Jr. as his successor. A man who sounds like a Simpsons caricature of an old-timey politician.
Let's just talk just a few moments about this grand old politics. Promise them anything, but forget it in Congress.
He ran an old-timey campaign with old-timey entertainment at his fundraisers.
Wasn't it fun? Wasn't it great? Wasn't it marvelous entertainment? The kind of fun the Democrats like.
And he said weird old-timey things like this.
And if any of you in this room are delegates and haven't made up your mind, I wanted you to know that these young ladies up here will be talking to you about support for Hubert Humphrey.
Humphrey didn't even enter the primary voting process. Instead, he was counting on support from the party heavyweights once the convention got going. It's a bit like an election for school captain. Sure, the kids get a vote, but the teachers actually get to decide who wins. And President Johnson was like the principal. Humphrey was the principal's favourite, and all the teachers liked him too. McCarthy didn't really have a chance. But as the party officials arrived, things were very, very tense.
You fellas are all good football players, right?
To make sure the proceedings weren't disturbed by anti-war protesters, Mayor Daley had pulled out all the stops. He built barbed wire fences, put the cops on 12-hour shifts, deployed the National Guard, and covered sewer grates with tar to stop protesters popping up like Oscar the Grouch. And so, on August 26, 1968, in a fortress surrounded by slaughterhouses, the Democratic Convention began.
Chicago, Illinois, the convention of the Democratic Party, nominating tonight its candidate for the presidency.
Hubert Humphrey was nervous. While the delegates were theoretically his, they could choose to vote for someone else. But Mayor Daley and President Johnson had Humphrey's back. The convention was set up with Humphrey supporters closest to the podium to shout out supportive stuff like this.
To the next President of the United States, Hubert Humphrey.
Their microphones were turned up louder. When other candidates' delegates tried to interrupt proceedings, they were shouted down.
Wisconsin is not recognized for that purpose.
And Mayor Daley himself ran around the convention hall as stage manager, trying to overwhelm the chaos with his own personal form of chaos. Outside, the anti-war protesters were angry. Tens of thousands of hippies, yippies, yappies, flower children, etc. set up camps in Chicago's parks, unable to get close to the amphitheatre.
The whole world is watching, chants the crowd on the side.
They clashed with police outside the Hilton Hotel where most of the delegates and media were staying. The air was thick with tear gas and stink bombs. Inside the convention, the air was thick with tobacco smoke from thousands of angry delegates, horrified at what Mayor Daley's police were doing to the protesters outside.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mayor Daley sat inside the convention as left-wing delegates accused him of allowing police brutality.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
Humphrey, knowing that most Democrats were against the war, wanted to include a promise for peace talks with the Viet Cong in the party's platform. Johnson refused to let him. Punch-ons began on the floor.
Take your hands off of me unless you plan to arrest me. Wait a minute. Well, Walter, as you can see...
CBS News reporter Dan Rather got punched in the stomach while reporting.
I'm sorry to be out of breath, but somebody belted me in the stomach doing that.
I think we've got a bunch of thugs here, Dan.
Outside the Hilton Hotel, a shocking battle took place between police and protesters as the news cameras were rolling. The convention finally ended with, miraculously, no fatalities, but hundreds of people were arrested and wounded. Hubert Humphrey was confirmed as the Democratic Party's candidate, but he now led a party that was hopelessly divided. He went on to be defeated by Richard Nixon in the election in November. The Democrats would lose 4 of the next 5 presidential elections. The current situation with the Democrats is staggeringly similar. President Biden, forced out by health concerns like Johnson, has left the race too late to hold an open primary process to find a candidate. He, like Johnson, wants the party to nominate his Vice President, Kamala Harris, to be the candidate. The rank-and-file Democratic Party supporters and members will not get a say on who the candidate is.
There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, Yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
The Biden-Harris administration's support for one side of a foreign war, not in Vietnam, but in Gaza, is a hot-button issue.
Israel has a right to defend itself, and how it does so matters.
The party's convention is even being held in Chicago as well, also in late August, though thankfully not amongst those slaughterhouses. Their opponents, Trump and Nixon, are similar too, though Nixon had yet to get to the committing potential crimes to steal an election game. The Democrats can't afford to repeat the violence and bitterness of the 1968 convention, though. So despite the fact that there is a whole swathe of ambitious potential presidents waiting in the wings, the party is coalescing as quickly as possible around Kamala Harris. And with only 100 days to go and the memory of 1968 haunting their nightmares, they really have no other choice.
Mr. Democrat, Mr. Democrat, get behind the greatest party in the land. Mr. Democrat, Mr. Democrat, let's all vow to work together hand in hand.